Well, Nick Collier here again, and it's story time. But first, I want to show you the newest addition to the Nick Collier shop. It turns out that a company contacted me and said, hey, we have this project to make, or these projects to make. We're going to send you 2 or 3 per week, and can you make them? And I said, well, let's have a look and see what we've got here. And so I'm trying to find the piece. It's not in there. Anyhow, it's these little microscopic mandrels. It's here somewhere. Anyhow, we're going to get into this soon because there's some moves that I had to make here. And literally, they bought me this lathe, which is kind of cool. I mean, eventually, I'm going to pay them back, you know, in doing work. But I told them, I says, I need to have a lathe that is totally dedicated to this project because I don't want to have to tear it down and set it back up again. And they said, okay, go find yourself a lathe and we'll pay for it. I'm like, okay, I guess they're committed. So anyhow, got the lathe. We're going to go through this at another point. For right now, let's go and talk about how I became what I'm doing now and the whole progression. And as far back as I can remember, I was probably 6 years old, maybe 7, and I'm designing speakers and radio components so that I can turn them off and on from my bed, and you know, and all kinds of different things. And I loved buying little plastic cars and customizing them and making them really, really cool, and then, you know, entering contests. You know, that pretty much covered from probably 6 or 7 years old till I was in my teens, and you know, all of a sudden, girls showed up. So that said, once I reached my teens, you know, things got a little confusing. I still did things, and oh, by the way, Dad was totally jealous of what I was doing. He was jealous of pretty much everything having to do with me, pretty much because, you know, Mom loved me more than she loved him, as it always is. But he couldn't see that. So anyhow, you know, his favorite thing was, oh, you know, I designed this really cool speaker system so I could turn the volume up and down from my bed. And his only comment was, oh, you got to find the easy way out every time, don't you, Nick? And I'm like, you know, at that age, I took it in as, you know, and those shaming words. But, you know, of course, now I realize the guy was a jerk. So let's move on into my early teen years. I, you know, worked on bicycles, made custom bike parts, and you know, all kinds of things that related to bicycles because, you know, that's what I had. And as I get into my later teen years, got a driver's license, got a car, I was totally enthralled with the gasoline engine, and I became a grease monkey motorhead. That's you know, that's all I could see was cars. I got a job at the local gas station pumping gas, and you know, in those days gas stations weren't just pumping gas and have a little store in there. There was no store. It was pumping gas and 3 or 4 auto bays where they did repairs. And so I kind of gotten got broke in by this older guy named Vern, and he just kind of took me under his wing and showed me how to do brake jobs and showed me how to adjust timing and adjust valves and just, you know, the whole gambit. And so yeah, for probably 5 years I had that job. And then we went on, and actually Vern ended up getting himself another gas station. He was working for Bob Smith at the time I got the job, and then later on Vern moved over to another mobile station, and he had 3 or 4 bays, and I went to work for him just because it was easy. And because I just loved working on cars, and he just put me in the bay, and he said, "Oh, you just do brake adjustments and tire repairs and that sort of thing." And I ended up buying this 1959 Corvette. I was probably, I don't know, 19 at that point. And oh man, it was just the coolest car. I mean, it was kind of beat up, but it still had coolness all over it. And I bought it, and I drove it around for a while, and it turns out that the rings and valves were in pretty bad shape. So it was blowing smoke out of the back. So, you know, Vern says, "Hey, if you want to rebuild that engine, you can use that in bay. We hardly ever use it. Just pull your car in there and tear this sucker apart." And I'm like, wow, cool. So I pulled the vet in there, tore the engine out, tore it completely down, had it machined, and knew this and knew that, and over, you know, a cam that was like a race cam and extra large pistons, and oh man, I just went nuts. And all the time working for Vern and paying for this as I go. And I didn't have anything else to spend my money on, so hey, what the hell, why not? So I completed the car, and man, it just ran so sweet. And you know, this big, huge engine in there, 2 4s, you know, custom exhaust. You know, there's all the cool stuff. So that kind of worked its way eventually into, I traded that car for a 1957, I believe, Harley Panhead. Big handlebars, long extended front end, custom paint job. I mean, it was the coolest bike in the world, you know. And the Harley 74, back in those days, that was the biggest engine they made. Oh man, it was a bike and a half. And I pretty much, I rode that bike for, I think a year before, you know, that winter came around, and you can't really ride in the winter, so I tore that sucker completely down and built it back up. At the time I was living with my girlfriend, she had a garage. I just took over the garage and built this bike up through the winter. Still working for Vern, by the way. And turned it into a pretty cool looking machine. I mean, it was as good as it gets at that point. You know, extended front ends, custom paint, custom, you know, lots of chrome. It was easy back then. You know, you just took the stuff down to the chrome shop, and they did the whole thing, and it was pretty cheap. So that Harley, and while I was working in my garage, I'm just kind of working away, and you know, other bikers got wind that I was building my bike. So they dropped by, and we'd have a beer or smoke a J and hang out. And after a while, 1 or 2 of them said, "Hey, can you fix my bike?" And well, yeah, sure. You know, they brought it in, I fixed it, and at first I just, I said, no, it's just fine. How much is it? And I said, no problem. And after a while, that became a little busier. More people kept coming. And so had I been working on a car or something like that, it'd been a whole different ball game. But as it was, I was working on loud ass Harleys. And I'm sitting in a neighborhood, and it's a quiet neighborhood at that. And these loud motorcycles would pull in and pull into my garage, and I'd be running the grinders and making all kinds of racket. And eventually the county came out and said, you can't really do this in your garage. And I'm like, yeah, okay. So I went out and found myself a little shed out there in the middle of Hayward, which is where I lived. And it was, the guy just, I found it was in the back of the ghettos. We called it the ghettos. It was like 4 or 5 of these little buildings. They were just slum buildings. And the landlord was a little Asian guy. And these buildings were just trashed. I mean, trashed. They were filled with garbage, and the roofs were leaking and everything. And I says, well, hey, would you be interested in renting the building? He says, well, you could just move in and clean it up, and you can have it. I'm like, oh, cool, yeah. So I went in there, cleaned it all up, and got it all set up, and put a new roof on it, and kind of buttoned it up, and open for business. Psychotherapy, which is what I called it. And the people that were coming to my girlfriend's house at the time just came over to this shop. And it got busier and busier and busier. And, after a while, and hopefully I'll show you some pictures right here. But after a while, the shop, it got, I could see that I had to take all my machine work out. And I could see that, there was money to be made if I could just get a lathe. And so at some point, somebody, I put the word out, and somebody said, hey, there's a lathe. This woman's got a lathe over here. She's got for sale. And it was like, I think it was $600 or something like that. And by the way, it was this exact lathe, not this particular lathe, but this model, this make, for $600. And a bunch of tooling, and just literally a truckload of steel. So I haul that stuff all back over, and I have no idea what to do with a lathe. But I'd seen them work. I've seen, what you could do with it. So I just chucked some metal up into the lathe and started fiddling around with it and trying to figure out what the hell's going on. And so I'm like 18 at this point. And I probably spent, while I'm still customizing Harleys, and I got the welding stuff down, and I, customizing frames, and still sending out the machine projects. And I decided, well, okay, after a while, I got to start to get a little better at the lathe and understand it a little better, and I started, instead of sending stuff out, I do it in shop, and all of a sudden the money started coming in, and I'm like, whoa, this is pretty cool. Whenever I couldn't figure something out on my own, and there were many times in those early days, I'd go find somebody who knew the answer. I probably had about 4 machine shops that I took projects to over, while I was still trying to figure it out. And I'd take a project over and ask this guy, and he'd kind of walk me through it, and so it was pretty much a seat of the pants sort of engineering process that I went through. So I just kept going at it. Probably for another year or so, my shop was in the ghetto. And one day the landlord came to me, and we were on good terms. But, there was a lot of Harleys coming in and out and tough guy stuff going on. And one day he comes to me, he says, well, I'm going to tear the buildings down. And I said, oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that. So I said, well, give me a couple months. I got to figure out where to move to. And so at that point, every Friday afternoon, because I wasn't smoking pot during the week, I was just smoking it on the weekend only. And so Friday afternoon, 5 o'clock exactly, I'd fire up my first joint. And after a while, all my buddies would show up. And there'd probably be 20 people every Friday afternoon. At about 4:30, they'd start showing up. And at 5 o'clock, I'd close the doors and we'd sit inside of my shop and just party hardy. And it was pretty cool. I have some really great memories of that. And so the landlord says, hey, I'm going to tear the buildings down. I said, well, okay, fine. So, I found a new place out in Fremont, which was about 20 miles away. And I got my buddies together one afternoon on a Friday afternoon. We smoked a bunch of pot and we literally tore the buildings down because the guy was tearing the buildings down. So, we were ripping boards out and tearing, knocking the walls down. We were having a great time. And it turns out a couple of months later, I find out through the grapevine that he didn't want to tear the buildings down. He just wanted me to leave. Had he said that, I would have left. It would have been no problem. But he was afraid to tell me. I was kind of the tough guy. And I felt really bad about that. Because, he had to clean up the mess. But, I assumed that he was going to tear the buildings down and he was going to have to clean up the mess anyhow. Anyhow, we go on. And I move out to Fremont, which was only about 20 miles away. But all of a sudden, my clientele, for some reason, that 20 miles, they just wouldn't do it. They wouldn't come out there. So I'm sitting in this shop, little shop, taking in a tenth of what I took in prior to moving. And nobody seemed to want to come out to Fremont. Now, of course, Friday afternoons, all my buddies would show up and we'd have a great time. But the customer-wise, that didn't happen. And so in trying to kind of maneuver around that shift, and I'd always had this in my mind, I started manufacturing motorcycle parts. And I had this lathe, and I didn't have a mill at the time because mills were very expensive and they weren't throwing them away like they are these days. But I had the lathe, and I could maneuver around that, and I made sissy bars and shifting mechanisms and foot pegs and the simple stuff. And then took it out throughout the Bay Area to probably about 20 stores and supplied them with my product. And that turned out to be a reasonably good income. And after a while, I started getting really good at using the lathe, and I wasn't a machinist by any means, but I was a machine operator. And then at some point, my wife and I separated. I decided I was tired of dealing with bikers. This was in the 70s, and most bikers were still kind of tough guys or wannabe tough guys, which was even worse because they got to prove themselves, and and typically they want to prove themselves with me, and it's like I really didn't want to deal with the violence and idiocy that went on around that. And plus, give them a few drugs, and oh man, they're really off to the races. So I closed the shop. And as I said, my wife and I split up. I closed the shop, and I went back to college. And it took a few months for that whole transition to take place, and then back to college, just for nothing else to do. I needed to stay in the Bay Area for another year. I wanted to move up to the mountains, but I needed to stay in the Bay for another year. And so I just, pretty much went to Chabot Junior College. And I took math and all the regular standard subjects, and fairly quickly I realized I didn't want anything to do with those regular subjects, and I ended up in the art department. And I'm like, I'm being honored as an artist. And I realized that the motorcycles that I built were an art form. And I'm like, well, I guess I've been an artist this whole time without even knowing it. And so that said, I pretty much spent that entire year in the art department. Ceramics, figure drawing, sculpture, even a couple others, and I can't think of what it was. Just exploring art. And so by the time I moved up to Nevada City, which is where I'm at right now, I was a full-fledged artist. And so I landed in Nevada City with $50 in my pocket. I had rented an apartment. I lived in this apartment. I had food for a month, and I had $50 in my pocket, so I had to get a job. And it turns out that in town there was this button manufacturing company, and I walked in there one day, and I'm looking for a job, and I said, well, I'm looking for a job. And she said, well, what can you do? And I said, well, I'm pretty good at machines. I can fix them and run a lathe and that sort of thing. And she says, oh, really? She's follow me. So she takes me downstairs, and here is this whole button manufacturing outfit. There's probably 50 button machines, and there's these little punch presses about this big, and they're custom built just to make buttons. And and they were all made at the turn of the century, and that's not the turn of the 20th century. That's the turn of the 19th century. They had been running for 100 years at that point, or 70 years. And she says, these things break down all the time. I want you to fix them. And she says, there's a lathe over there. There's a drill press. There's a couple other tools hanging around. Just keep them running. I said, great. I mean, this is exactly what I wanted to do. So for about 8 months, for 4 days a week, I would go down into this little dungeon, and these button maker girls, there was probably 5 of them, they're all in their 40s or 50s, and they're just sitting there just making buttons all day long. It's just like drove me nuts. These women just sitting there constantly, button after button after button, making probably 500 buttons an hour. And these machines going clickety click, clickety click, clickety. The whole thing was intense. And I was at the age where I just wanted to go down a river and look at the naked women. But, I needed to make some money, and I figured I better do that. So I kept these machines running, and the girls was like, oh, you can fix this machine here. It's, So I'd go in and adjust and maybe make a new part for it. Had a great time. It was actually a great job. And then that job ended. Well, it didn't end. I quit after 9 months, and I just hated going down into that dungeon and listening to all of that noise. And then I moved out into the woods for a year. No electricity, no running, well, a little bit of running water, no flush toilets, and hippiedom extravaganza, out into a hippie commune. Lived there for a year, finally came back and landed in this little cabin way out in the woods again, about 5 or 6 miles from town. My neighbor was a jeweler, and I was pretty broke. I'm literally paying $35 a month rent for this cabin and $11 for utilities, and I was 7 months behind. That's how broke I was. And everybody kind of just felt sorry for me. So my next door neighbor was a jeweler, and he kept saying, "Hey man, let me show you how to make some jewelry and you can make some money." And I'm like, well, I really don't want to do that because I'm an artist and I don't want to get money involved in my art. I was 25, completely full of myself. So after a while, long story short, in that situation, after a while I did make some jewelry and I just went nuts. I built a booth, I made a body of work, and by that next spring I did my first craft show. At the end of that first craft show, I made $235 and I was rich. I was like, whoa, you can actually make money doing this stuff. And so 35 years later, I've got a pretty good going business. Everything seems to plug along nicely. The 9/11 happened. And 9/11 scared everybody, now for good reason. And literally my business that next spring, because I would do shows from spring until Christmas, and then from Christmas till spring there'll be nothing. So that's when I would come into my shop and make stuff on my own, or fiddle with stuff on the property or whatever. 9/11 happened. Everybody was scared for the next couple of months till Christmas. There was no Christmas for me. We went through that winter, came to next spring. I mean, literally with craft shows, you have to pay for the show 6 months in advance. You book the show 6 months in advance. So I booked a bunch of shows for that next summer. And that next summer, literally, shows that I would go out to and make $5,000 at, I made $50 that whole summer. It would be just like, what happened? And we got to the end of that year and we were probably 20, 30 grand in the hole. And pretty much my jewelry business just evaporated into thin air. So at that point, we're kind of scrambling around, and we, up to that point, I had a small shop with a couple of tools, a little lathe, the little South Bend that I use all the time. I had that, a couple of drill presses and that sort of thing, and so. In trying to be flexible, once again, I started making stuff. And again, the neighbor would come over, or they'd tell a friend, and the friend would come over and say, "Hey, can you make me this part here?" And I'd make it and charge them, a going rate at that point. And then from there on, I just, you know, every time I get a little extra money, I'd buy a tool, and then, you know, figure out how to use it, and that brings us right 20 years later to 2021, and probably by about 2015 I had purchased my mill, and that just opened up my business to, you know, so many possibilities. And it's pretty much been that ever since. And that's the story. Nick Collier, checking out.